On April 12, 1961, humanity took its first true step toward the stars. Yuri Gagarin's historic flight aboard Vostok 1 was more than just an achievement of Soviet engineering. It was a statement that Earth's sky was no longer the limit. His brief orbit around the planet lasted only 108 minutes, but in that short time, he proved that humans could leave their world and return safely. It was a moment that ignited a new era, one that would eventually lead to the first settlements beyond Earth. In the decades that followed, space exploration advanced rapidly. The Apollo program landed the first humans on the moon in 1969, an achievement that, while monumental, was only a prelude to what was to come. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, robotic missions to Mars had provided detailed scans of the planet's surface, confirming the presence of water ice and revealing landscapes that, with the right technology, could one day support human life. Yet, despite technological progress, political and economic challenges delayed humanity's first attempts at interplanetary settlement. It wasn't until the latter half of the 21st century that real momentum toward Mars colonization began. The development of reusable spacecraft in the 2020s made space travel significantly more affordable, and by the 2040s, permanent stations were established in orbit around both Earth and the Moon. These stations became critical proving grounds for long-duration space missions, testing life support systems and radiation shielding that would be vital for deep space travel. Advances in propulsion technology, particularly nuclear thermal and ion drives, reduced travel time between Earth and Mars from months to mere weeks, making sustained missions feasible for the first time. The first crewed landing on Mars occurred in 2061, exactly 1 century after Gagarin's historic flight. The mission, a collaboration between multiple space agencies and private aerospace firms, set foot in the Argyre-Planitia region, chosen for its relative safety and access to subsurface ice deposits. The crew remained on the surface for just over a month, conducting geological surveys and testing experimental habitats before returning to Earth. Though temporary, this mission laid the foundation for what would follow. By 2044, several long-standing regional disputes ignited into open hostilities, dragging multiple nations into a conflict that rapidly spiraled out of control. Although some military planners still envisioned a traditional ground war, the reality was far more devastating. Over the following year, the scale of destruction pushed once opposing factions to the negotiation table, although isolated battles continued in contested zones. A fragile truce was brokered by a coalition of mediators who had warned that any additional nuclear exchanges risked rendering large swaths of the planet uninhabitable. The final armistice was signed in 2055. This dark period also convinced many to look beyond Earth for a second chance. In the war's wake, large-scale investment in off-world projects became the new global priority. Initiatives aimed at Luna and Mars gained renewed support, setting the stage for a wider exodus from a planet still bearing the scars of its third global conflict. By 2080, permanent Martian habitats had begun to take shape. Early settlements were constructed underground or within heavily shielded domes, protecting settlers from the planet's harsh radiation and thin atmosphere. Terraforming, though still theoretical at the time, became a major field of study, with research focused on methods of thickening the atmosphere and introducing microbial life that could begin altering the environment on a planetary scale. Meanwhile, corporations and private enterprises established footholds on Mars, mining valuable minerals and ice deposits to support the growing off-world economy. Humanity's presence on Mars was no longer a question of if, but when it would expand beyond small settlements into fully sustainable cities. As the 22nd century approached, the first major wave of Martian colonists prepared to leave Earth behind, knowing that they were no longer simply explorers. They were the first citizens of a world that would one day stand alongside Earth as a home for humanity. The period between 2110 and 2150 marked a decisive shift in human activity beyond Earth, heralding the first permanent steps toward off-world settlement. In 2112, construction teams and scientific staff established a pioneering research station on Luna's southern rim, chosen for its consistent sunlight and stable terrain. The project quickly expanded, and by 2115, Habitable modules housed a modest population of engineers, fueling lunar mining and experimental agriculture. These early experiments in sustaining life off Earth laid the groundwork for larger endeavors, as resource surveys revealed deposits of helium-3 and rare metals valuable to emerging fusion technologies. Interest soon turned to Mars, where thin atmosphere and harsh conditions posed greater challenges. In 2122, following extensive orbital surveys, a consortium of private firms and terrestrial governments formed the Martian Development Pact. Its primary goal was to create sheltered habitats and begin controlled atmospheric alterations. By 2130, several dome cities dotted the Martian plains, each connected by sealed rail systems designed to protect inhabitants from dust storms. The progress was slow but steady, as dedicated research teams refined terraforming prototypes that aimed to convert subsurface ice into a more robust planetary water cycle. In 2045, the Global Terraforming Council noted the first measurable rise in local atmospheric pressure, offering fresh hope for Mars eventually supporting open-air settlements. In 2155, a consortium of engineering firms unveiled the first commercial fusion drives, an achievement that swiftly reshaped interplanetary travel. After years of research funded by lucrative helium-3 extraction on Luna, these new reactors replaced older nuclear fission systems and chemical rockets that once limited voyage durations. Vessels equipped with the fusion drives could traverse between Earth and Mars in a fraction of the previous time, drastically reducing the costs and risks associated with interplanetary freight and passenger transport. The shift began quietly early in the year, when an independent operator successfully tested a prototype drive in a demonstration run between Earth orbit and the orbital ring around Luna. Within weeks, commercial shipyards adopted the technology. By the close of 2155, most scheduled cargo and passenger lines were ordering retrofits to exploit the faster speeds. This boom in fusion propulsion spurred an economic surge, enabling settlements throughout the Sol system to trade more freely and receive vital supplies in days instead of months. Officials on Mars reported that consistent deliveries of key materials accelerated dome expansion projects, while newly constructed docking platforms on Luna saw a dramatic rise in both traffic and investment. Before the invention of the frame shift drive in the 22nd century, interstellar travel was an impossibly slow endeavor, measured not in months or years, but in generations. The only way to reach distant stars was through vast self-sustaining vessels designed to carry entire populations across the void, generation ships. Launched between the late 21st and early 23rd centuries, these ships represented humanity's first real attempt at colonizing distant worlds. Each vessel was an enclosed ecosystem, equipped with agricultural modules, life support systems, and artificial gravity generators to sustain multiple generations of travelers. Many of these ships departed from Earth long before faster-than-light travel became a reality, carrying thousands of colonists who knew they would never live to see their final destination. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would inherit both the journey and the responsibility of keeping their fragile society alive.
Order! Order! I will have order in the house! It is decided then. The mission is changed. We, the elected council of the Odysseus, decree that all members of the crew remain on board, and all resources for the ill-conceived planetary colonization mission are to be reallocated to enable the Odysseus to sustain us. Order! Order! Any and all attempts to leave the ship, question the council, or otherwise reinstate the previous mission parameters is to be considered a capital offense. For the greater good.
Without the ability to communicate across interstellar distances, each ship was on its own, drifting further from human space, with no way to call for help if something went wrong. By the time the first frame shift drives were developed in the 2200s, the era of generation ships had effectively ended. Faster-than-light travel rendered their long, slow journeys obsolete, and many of the later ships were either recalled or scrapped before departure. However, the fate of those that had already set sail remained a mystery. Some historians estimate that dozens of generation ships may still be drifting in deep space, their inhabitants long dead or trapped in a state of isolation so profound that they may not even realize the rest of humanity has surpassed them. Over the centuries, scattered reports have surfaced of abandoned vessels found adrift in the void, their hulls eerily silent, their life support systems long since failed. Some were discovered with no survivors, their populations having perished from technical failures, disease, or internal conflict. Others were found empty, with no explanation as to where their inhabitants had gone. Rumors persist of ships still operating, their people having developed entirely new cultures, unaware that the galaxy they once sought to escape has left them behind. Despite the advancements of modern space travel, the legacy of the generation ships endures as a sobering reminder of the risks humanity once took to reach the stars.
Medical Officer's Log 6933. We've done it. We're down on the surface and the habitats are all fully operational. No more supply runs to the ship and back. We've established 5 settlements in this region, with another 10 spread across the other regions. The elected leaders of each group have voted and declared the mission a success. Many of the settlements have decommissioned their landers as a sign of this, even holding ceremonies to celebrate our new life here. However, it appears our new home may not be as welcoming as we had hoped for. Much of the indigenous flora and fauna have proven to be toxic and highly aggressive. Several of the crew have been attacked while gathering food and supplies, and we have lost a few people to various incidents involving local plant life. Settlement Alpha and Beta have also been having problems with animal attacks. By all accounts, they've had it worse than us, with entire teams being lost. We've posted additional sentries to guard the settlement, but we're not a military operation. We're explorers and colonists. The best we have is an ex-security officer to keep us safe. We were simply not expecting such a hostile environment.
In 2170, researchers announced the first functional prototypes of hyperdrives, introducing a radical departure from conventional fusion propulsion. Initial tests were conducted under strict secrecy on specialized orbital platforms near Earth, where miniaturized reactors combined with experimental field projectors allowed short but significant shifts in local spacetime. Although these early flights were limited to small crew modules, they swiftly demonstrated the potential for crossing vast distances at unprecedented speeds. Throughout that year, engineering teams struggled to maintain drive stability, reporting occasional fluctuations in shielding systems whenever the modules attempted to travel beyond lunar orbit. Despite setbacks, a breakthrough occurred in late 2170 when a test craft successfully entered an accelerated transit corridor toward the outer Sol region and completed a round trip to Jupiter's orbital path. Although the journey took hours rather than days, it was enough to convince investors and policymakers that hyperdrives could reshape long-distance travel. By the close of 2171, plans were underway to refine these prototypes for larger vessels, paving the way for future endeavors that would extend well beyond the confines of familiar planetary orbits. In 2242, representatives from Earth, Mars, and a growing number of off-world settlements ratified a unifying charter that established the Federation as an official interstellar authority. This act was the result of decades of negotiations aimed at resolving ongoing disputes over resource extraction and trade regulations, which had intensified after the successful colonization drives in the 22nd century. Many recognized that a centralized framework could avert future conflicts, particularly as remote outposts and colonies began calling for greater protection and consistent governance. The charter's signing took place on August 12th of that year, a date quickly commemorated by colony populations who saw it as an assurance that their economic and political interests would be safeguarded. Supporters hailed the new federation as a champion of democratic ideals and cooperation, though critics noted the growing influence of powerful corporate interests woven into its founding documents. By 2245, membership in the Federation had grown to include not just planetary authorities within Sol, but also a network of frontier stations scattered across neighboring star systems. Each saw the Federation's structured protocols as a stabilizing force, unifying disparate regions under a single set of interstellar laws. Despite early skepticism, the Federation soon became the backbone of human expansion, paving the way for faster, more coordinated development efforts far beyond the cradle of Earth. The Third War began with a sharp escalation of political tensions in the late 2070s, fueled by scarce resources and ideological rivalries among the remaining superpowers on Earth. The early 24th century saw an unprecedented surge in human expansion beyond Sol, driven by advances in hyperdrive technology and the growing economic influence of the Federation. By 2300, the first major colonization fleets had reached systems like Beta Hydri and Delta Pavonis, establishing permanent settlements that would soon become vital trade and industrial centers. These new territories not only provided fresh resources, but also reinforced the Federation's claim as the dominant political force in human space. In 2312, a second wave of settlers, backed by corporate and government-funded initiatives, arrived in Beta Hydri. Within a decade, the system had become a hub of economic activity, boasting vast orbital shipyards and high-output manufacturing centers supplying deep space ventures. Delta Pavonis followed a similar trajectory, with its temperate worlds quickly transformed into self-sustaining colonies by the 2330s. These systems, among others, formed the backbone of an interstellar economy that fed Federation industries and secured its hold over the rapidly expanding human frontier. The pace of expansion brought inevitable tensions, both within the Federation and beyond. Independent settlements often resisted centralized governance, and the presence of corporate-backed colonies led to political disputes over taxation, resource rights, and military oversight. Despite these challenges, by 2350, the Federation had firmly established itself as the most powerful human organization, with its influence extending over hundreds of star systems. Its policies, shaped by both economic pragmatism and political ambition, would define the course of interstellar human civilization for centuries to come. The 25th century marked a new phase of human expansion, not just into the stars, but onto worlds that had once been deemed uninhabitable. By 2400, the steady march of technological progress had transformed terraforming from a theoretical pursuit into a practical, large-scale industry. The Federation, with its vast economic resources and corporate partnerships, led the charge in reshaping planetary environments to support human life. Within a few decades, entire worlds that had once been barren rock or frozen wastelands were being converted into thriving colonies, their atmospheres engineered and their surfaces cultivated for industry and habitation. Advances in atmospheric processing, first tested successfully on small-scale projects in the mid-2400s, allowed for the controlled release of tailored chemical compounds into planetary atmospheres. By 2432, key colony worlds in the Beta Hydri and Delta Pavonis systems had seen noticeable climate shifts, making outdoor activity possible without full environmental suits. Larger projects followed, targeting high-value worlds in systems such as Altair and 39 Serpentis, where extensive mining operations had already laid the groundwork for eventual colonization. Though full planetary transformations remained a slow process, the ability to modify atmospheric conditions and stabilize ecosystems ensured a steady influx of settlers to these growing hubs. Space station construction also entered a golden age during this period. The first modular O'Neill-class habitats, introduced in 2457, demonstrated that orbital stations could support millions of inhabitants, becoming centers of commerce and research. By 2480, megacorporations had fully embraced the station-building boom, constructing massive orbital complexes in resource-rich systems, allowing industry to flourish where planetary conditions remained too extreme for terraforming. These stations provided not only trade opportunities, but also the logistical backbone for deeper exploration into uncharted space. By the end of the century, Earth's industries had expanded across hundreds of star systems, binding them together through trade networks and political alliances. The transformation of barren landscapes into thriving population centers reinforced the Federation's dominance, while independent and corporate-backed settlements found new opportunities amid the vast resources of deep space. Yet as humanity's reach extended further, the challenge of governing such a vast and diverse civilization grew ever more complex. The frontier continued to push outward, but tensions simmered beneath the surface as new powers sought to challenge the established order. During the Federation's rise, a separatist movement took shape, helmed by idealists disillusioned with corporate-dominated politics. One such group, led by the charismatic Marlon Duval, journeyed toward an uncharted sector. They eventually claimed a star system that would become known as Achenar, laying the foundation for what would evolve into the Empire. By 2590, tensions within the Federation had reached a breaking point for those who sought a new way of life beyond the influence of corporate-backed governance. Among them was Marlon Duval, a visionary leader who had grown disillusioned with the Federation's growing reliance on megacorporations to dictate policy. Along with a group of idealists, engineers, and pioneers, she led an ambitious expedition out of Federation-controlled space, seeking a fresh start in the uncharted frontier. The journey was not without risk. While hyperdrive technology had made interstellar travel routine, the voyage to their chosen destination, a distant, unclaimed system later known as Achenar, required precision and careful resource management. By late 2590, the first wave of settlers arrived, establishing a provisional outpost on Achenar 6D, a moon deemed suitable for initial habitation. Early records indicate that the settlers focused on self-sufficiency, constructing biodomes and laying the groundwork for future expansion. Their vision was clear: a society free from corporate interference, where leadership was based on merit and strength rather than bureaucratic entanglements. Though their independence had been achieved, the settlers soon faced internal divisions over governance. Marlon Duval envisioned a republic that would preserve personal freedoms while maintaining order, but some among her followers believed a more centralized structure was necessary for long-term survival. These ideological differences, though subdued in the early years, would eventually lead to one of the most significant shifts in human history. For now, Marlon's dream of a new civilization beyond the Federation had begun, and the foundations of what would one day become the Empire were being laid on the surface of an isolated world, far from the reach of Sol's influence. By 2600, the settlers of Achenar had established a thriving foothold in their new home. The early colony, centered on Achenar 6D, had grown from a collection of biodomes into a self-sustaining settlement, complete with hydroponic farms, advanced manufacturing facilities, and a newly built administrative center. Marlon Duval, who had led the expedition from Federation space, continued to oversee the colony's development, advocating for a society built on merit and individual responsibility. Under her leadership, the settlement prospered, drawing new arrivals who sought refuge from corporate control and bureaucratic inefficiency. However, her vision was not shared by all. Among those closest to her was her brother, Henson Duval, who had long believed that strong, centralized authority was the only way to ensure survival in the harsh conditions of deep space. While Marlon promoted democratic governance, Henson and his supporters argued that the colony required a singular, unquestioned ruler to enforce order and stability. These ideological differences created a rift within the leadership, though Marlon remained confident in her ideals. Then, in mid-2600, tragedy struck. Marlon Duval was killed in what was officially described as an unfortunate accident, a crash during a routine aerial survey of the colony's expanding infrastructure. However, the circumstances surrounding her death were never fully explained. Investigators found no clear mechanical failure, and those close to Marlon expressed doubts that an experienced pilot such as herself would have made a fatal miscalculation. Whispers of foul play spread through the colony, but before any formal inquiry could be launched, Henson Duval swiftly assumed control. With Marlon gone, Henson wasted no time in restructuring the colony's leadership. He dissolved the early governing councils and declared himself absolute ruler, asserting that only through decisive, singular command could Achenar survive and thrive. His supporters, many of whom had already held key positions in the settlement's security and resource management, enforced his authority without question. Within a matter of months, Achenar had transformed from an experiment in self-determination into a structured hierarchy where power resided solely in the hands of the Duval family. Despite lingering suspicions surrounding Marlin's death, resistance to Henson's rule was quickly subdued. Many settlers, wary of instability and uncertain about their future, accepted the new order in the hope that it would bring long-term security. Others, whether out of fear or genuine belief in his vision, rallied behind Henson as the true leader of Achenar. The shift was complete. The settlement had not only severed its ties to the Federation, but had also abandoned its founding principles. The seeds of an empire had been sown, and under the rule of Henson Duval, Achenar would become the birthplace of a new dynasty that would shape the course of human history for centuries to come. By the mid-27th century, the Duval dynasty had consolidated its rule over Achenar and the surrounding systems, shaping a society that stood in stark contrast to the Federation it had left behind. During this period, the empire expanded its reach, bringing nearby worlds under its control through a combination of diplomacy, economic incentives, and, when necessary, military force. The growing population and increasing demand for labor led to the institutionalization of an ancient practice that had long been abandoned in most human societies: slavery. Framed as a regulated system rather than an unchecked cruelty, imperial slavery was presented as a structured means of service and restitution. Criminals, debtors, and the impoverished were placed into legally sanctioned servitude, with the promise of eventual freedom once their obligations were fulfilled. By 2680, this practice had become deeply embedded in imperial culture. While critics outside the empire condemned it as an archaic relic of humanity's darker past, within imperial space, it was viewed as a mechanism of social order. Throughout this period, imperial technology flourished. Advances in shipbuilding, planetary engineering, and artificial intelligence allowed the empire to sustain its expanding territories and enforce its policies. Automated infrastructure supported the grand estates of the noble class, while military fleets patrolled the empire's growing borders, ensuring compliance and discouraging external interference. The Federation watched with concern, wary of an emerging power that had abandoned democracy in favor of hereditary rule. Yet, despite ideological opposition, the empire's efficiency and discipline could not be ignored. By 2700, the foundations of the empire were fully established. The Duval lineage stood unchallenged. The nobility controlled vast resources, and the population, conditioned by centuries of imperial doctrine, largely accepted their roles in the social order. Slavery, no longer seen as a moral question but as an institutional necessity, continued to expand under the careful regulation of the state. The empire had become not just an alternative to the Federation, but its equal in power and influence. The stage was set for future conflicts, as the two superpowers, each built on vastly different ideals, began to shape the destiny of human civilization across the stars. In these formative years, the Federation and Empire rarely clashed directly. Each needed breathing room to expand and consolidate power. Nevertheless, tensions rose with each new system claimed, as both superpowers jockeyed for influence, wealth, and prestige. By the 28th and 29th centuries, human-controlled space sprawled across hundreds of star systems. New alliances, independent colonies, and corporate ventures sprang up, some aligning with the Federation, others with the Empire, and many seeking complete independence. By the dawn of the 28th century, the balance of power between the Federation and the Empire had reached a fragile equilibrium, with both superpowers expanding their influence across the stars. While neither side openly declared war, tensions simmered beneath the surface, manifesting in proxy conflicts and political maneuvering across contested regions. Every newly discovered system became a potential flashpoint, as both factions sought to secure valuable resources, strategic outposts, and ideological dominance. In 2812, a resource-rich world in the Tau Ceti sector became one of the first major battlegrounds of this shadow war. A Federation-backed corporate consortium attempted to establish mining operations, only to find itself embroiled in a bitter struggle with Imperial-aligned settlers. Skirmishes between security forces escalated into full-scale engagements, forcing both superpowers to intervene diplomatically, while covertly supplying their respective factions with military hardware. This pattern repeated itself throughout the century, with conflicts erupting in regions such as Luton's Star and Shibotis, where rival colonies clashed under the guise of local disputes while serving the broader agendas of their distant patrons. Despite these hostilities, outright war never came. The cost of such a conflict, both in human lives and economic stability, was deemed too great. Instead, the Federation and the Empire relied on espionage, sabotage, and political influence to undermine one another. In 2854, a high-profile defection of an Imperial senator to the Federation exposed a network of spies operating within Imperial space, leading to a brief but intense diplomatic standoff. The Empire retaliated by restricting trade routes to Federation-aligned worlds, sparking economic disruptions that sent shockwaves through the interstellar markets. By 2890, both sides had grown adept at waging war without engaging in direct combat. The development of advanced drone fleets and automated military platforms allowed for plausible deniability in regional conflicts, while corporations and mercenary groups thrived in the lawless frontier, profiting from the endless struggle between the two superpowers. Though the battles remained contained, the stakes were higher than ever. As the century drew to a close, it became increasingly clear that neither the Federation nor the Empire could afford to let their guard down, for even a minor miscalculation could tip the delicate balance and plunge human civilization into total war. By 2950, the vast expanse of human space had outgrown the ability of the major superpowers to effectively police and regulate it. While the Federation and the Empire maintained a firm grip on their core territories, the frontier systems remained largely lawless, with independent colonies, corporate enclaves, and mercenary groups operating beyond the reach of centralized governance. The growing instability, marked by piracy, unregulated warfare, and widespread exploitation, prompted a coalition of frontier leaders, traders, and security forces to establish a new cooperative framework to bring order to the outer reaches. This initiative would come to be known as the Galactic Cooperative of Worlds, or GalCop. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of the Federation or the Empire, GalCop was founded on mutual benefit and shared responsibility. It was not a nation-state, but a cooperative alliance, uniting independent worlds under a common set of interstellar laws. Among its earliest achievements was the establishment of a standardized bounty system in 2952, allowing local authorities to post rewards for the capture or elimination of criminals operating in their sectors. This system, backed by shared databases and interstellar communication networks, significantly improved security across participating regions. Private security firms, bounty hunters, and law enforcement officers now had a structured means of tracking and neutralizing threats, without the need for direct intervention from superpower authorities. GalCop also introduced trade regulations designed to curb exploitation by large-scale corporations, ensuring that smaller colonies had fair access to vital resources. By 2960, a network of arbitration courts had been set up to resolve disputes between traders, settlers, and corporate entities, further solidifying GalCop's role as a stabilizing force in the frontier. Though its power remained limited, relying heavily on voluntary cooperation rather than direct enforcement, its influence steadily grew as more worlds saw the benefits of joining the collective. While neither the Federation nor the Empire openly recognized GalCop as a governing body, both acknowledged its effectiveness in maintaining order in regions they had little interest in controlling directly. Over time, GalCop's model of decentralized governance would serve as inspiration for future independent movements, proving that stability and security could exist outside the rule of the galaxy's dominant superpowers. Though its long-term survival remained uncertain, by the end of the 2950s, GalCop had already reshaped the political landscape of the frontier, offering a glimpse of an interstellar society built not on conquest or control, but on cooperation. By the dawn of the 31st century, the pace of human expansion had accelerated beyond anything previously imagined. Advances in hyperdrive technology, particularly the refinement of frame-shift drives in the early 3000s, reduced long-range travel times from weeks to mere hours. Entire sectors of the galaxy that had once been beyond the reach of colonization were now open to pioneers, traders, and explorers willing to push the boundaries of known space. For the first time, independent pilots, rather than government-funded expeditions, became the driving force of deep space exploration. As more individuals took to the stars, the dangers of unregulated space travel became increasingly evident. Reports of ships disappearing in uncharted systems, frontier skirmishes between rival prospectors, and large-scale piracy surged between 3020 and 3050. Without a centralized authority to enforce laws in the far reaches, the need for an organized body to provide structure and support to interstellar pilots became clear. In response, a coalition of experienced explorers, veteran traders, and security specialists laid the foundations for what would become known as the Pilots Federation. Founded in 3055, the Pilots Federation was established as a neutral guild focused on training, licensing, and ranking starship operators. Unlike the bureaucratic institutions of the superpowers, the Federation operated independently, ensuring that those who took to the void had the skills, knowledge, and resources to survive in unpredictable environments. Membership quickly became a mark of prestige, with pilot rankings reflecting an individual's experience in combat, trade, and exploration. By 3080, most major spacefaring organizations recognized Pilots Federation licenses as the gold standard for independent operations, granting members docking privileges, insurance benefits, and access to specialized equipment. Despite its neutrality, the influence of the Pilots Federation grew rapidly, as its members played a crucial role in opening new trade routes, charting unknown systems, and enforcing the unwritten code of conduct that bound together the pilots of the frontier. While the great powers of the Federation and the Empire continued their political struggles, the Pilots Federation became something different, an entity beholden to no government, loyal only to the principles of exploration, self-reliance, and survival in the vast unknown. By 3100, the Pilots Federation had firmly established itself as an integral part of interstellar civilization. Its ranks included explorers who had mapped the edges of the galaxy, traders who had brokered deals beyond the reach of superpower-controlled space, and warriors who had defended the weak against the ever-present threats of lawlessness. Though humanity had spread across thousands of systems, true freedom in the galaxy belonged to those who dared to venture beyond the safety of controlled space, those who bore the insignia of the Pilots Federation and carved their own paths among the stars. During this era, smugglers, pirates, and private militias flourished, exploiting the cracks in overstretched governments. For many systems, daily life became a balancing act between local power struggles and the looming shadow of galactic superpowers. The seeds of unrest, collaboration, and new aspirations defined these centuries. Stories of strange vessels and unexplained ship disappearances began circulating among frontier explorers in the early 31st century. For decades, sightings were dismissed as rumors or illusions caused by experimental technology. That all changed when verified wreckage and inexplicable artifacts were recovered from deep space anomalies. In 3125, the first official records of an unknown extraterrestrial presence surfaced in classified reports circulated among high-ranking officials within the Federation and the Empire. Though rumors of strange encounters had persisted for decades, this was the first time evidence had been gathered and analyzed under strict secrecy. The name thargoid appeared in intercepted communications between deep space research stations describing an unidentified force operating beyond the reaches of human-controlled space. The earliest confirmed incident involved the disappearance of an independent exploration vessel near the Pleiades Nebula. When a recovery team arrived at the ship's last known coordinates, they found only fragmented hull plating, fused as if by extreme heat or an energy weapon unlike anything recorded in human warfare. Further analysis revealed organic material interwoven with the metallic remains, suggesting, for the first time, the existence of a non-human, bioengineered technology. By mid-3125, scattered reports from frontier pilots described encounters with highly maneuverable silent ships that did not conform to any known human design. Those who survived such encounters spoke of strange, flower-like vessels that emitted eerie pulses of electromagnetic energy, disabling ship systems before vanishing without a trace. Many dismissed these claims as the fabrications of opportunists seeking fame, but others, particularly those in classified research circles, began to take the threat seriously. The Empire and the Federation both launched independent investigations, though neither officially acknowledged the growing body of evidence. It was in this climate of uncertainty and suppressed knowledge that the name thargoid became synonymous with fear and speculation. Whether these beings were hostile, indifferent, or something else entirely remained unknown. But by the end of the year, one fact was beyond dispute. Humanity was no longer alone in the galaxy. By 3140, the sporadic encounters with unidentified alien vessels had escalated into something far more concerning. Reports from deep space settlements and frontier convoys described increasingly aggressive encounters with unknown ships that displayed unparalleled speed and maneuverability. Entire convoys disappeared without a trace, their last distress signals often garbled or cut short, leaving little clue as to what had happened. Those few who survived these encounters described weapons unlike anything in human arsenals: energy pulses that bypassed shielding, corrosive attacks that ate through hull plating, and electromagnetic bursts that rendered ships completely inoperable before their destruction. Independent systems near the frontier were the first to take action, forming makeshift defense fleets to patrol high-risk travel routes. However, their outdated technology and combat doctrine, developed for fighting human adversaries, proved ineffective against the mysterious alien craft. By 3145, a pattern had emerged. Isolated human settlements, mining operations, and exploratory fleets were being targeted, but the reasons remained unknown. Some speculated that humanity had inadvertently encroached on alien territory. Others feared these attacks were a precursor to a larger invasion. Despite mounting evidence, neither the Federation nor the Empire publicly acknowledged the existence of an external threat. Officials dismissed the reports as exaggerations or isolated piracy incidents, though leaked communications revealed increasing concern within military circles. In 3152, a classified Federation report surfaced detailing the loss of an entire naval squadron that had been dispatched to investigate disturbances in the Pleiades region. The last transmission from the fleet spoke of being surrounded by fast-moving contacts, followed by a burst of static and silence. By 3160, paranoia had taken hold in many outer settlements. Pilots refused high-risk cargo runs, and some colonies fortified their defenses in fear of an attack that might never come. Without clear evidence of the nature or intentions of these alien ships, humanity remained in a state of uneasy uncertainty. Some still clung to the belief that diplomacy was possible, while others prepared for the worst, convinced that the mysterious adversaries had no interest in coexistence. The question was no longer whether humanity had encountered an intelligent alien force, but rather how long it had before full-scale war erupted. By the year 3200, humanity's uneasy encounters with the thargoids had escalated beyond scattered skirmishes and unexplained disappearances. While no formal declaration of war had been made, it was clear to those in power that an alien force operated with unknown motives in the depths of the galaxy. Neither the Federation nor the Empire could afford to ignore the growing threat. And though their political rivalry remained as fierce as ever, both superpowers began taking drastic steps to prepare for the possibility of open conflict. The Federation, ever pragmatic, turned to the vast resources of its corporate sector, funneling unprecedented funding into private research and development. The arrangement allowed plausible deniability, keeping the bulk of the research outside of direct governmental oversight. By 3202, several of the largest defense contractors, including Core Dynamics and Achilles Aerospace, had begun classified projects aimed at reverse engineering thargoid technology. Research stations in deep space were quietly established, often disguised as independent scientific outposts. Leaked reports from one such facility near HIP 7692 hinted at breakthroughs in energy weapon research, though details were scarce. While official Federation policy downplayed the significance of the thargoid presence, the scale of its secret investment told another story. Meanwhile, the Empire took a different approach. Rather than rely on private corporations, Imperial Command concentrated its efforts within the Imperial Navy and its most trusted scientific divisions. Intelligence reports suggested that by 3205, covert Imperial research stations had been set up in the Pleiades sector, where thargoid activity had been most frequent. While little information was made public, intercepted communications hinted that the Empire was not only studying thargoid technology, but possibly attempting to integrate elements of it into its own military fleet. Speculation grew that select Imperial warships had been outfitted with experimental systems inspired by thargoid designs, though no official confirmation was ever made. By 3208, tensions had reached a breaking point. While both superpowers still viewed each other as their primary adversary, neither could ignore the potential consequences of being unprepared for an outright thargoid incursion. Diplomats continued to downplay the risk, yet military strategists on both sides saw the truth clearly. The next great war might not be between the Federation and the Empire, but between humanity and an enemy it still did not fully understand. Each side moved forward with its own research, unwilling to share findings even in the face of a common threat, and in doing so ensured that the future of interstellar conflict would be shaped as much by secrecy as by strategy. These first confirmed encounters reshaped humanity's perspective on its place in the galaxy. For the first time, humans confronted a species that might surpass them technologically, casting doubt on whether expansions into uncharted territory were wise or downright reckless. With the thargoid threat looming, many independent systems saw the need for mutual support and defense without surrendering sovereignty to either the Federation or the Empire. This sentiment crystallized into a formal coalition known as the Alliance. By 3230, the galaxy was in a state of growing unrest. While the Federation and the Empire remained locked in their endless struggle for dominance, the true dangers of the frontier had become impossible to ignore. The thargoid threat, once dismissed as a distant anomaly, was now an undeniable reality, and for the countless independent systems caught between the superpowers, survival was becoming increasingly uncertain. It was in this volatile climate that a new movement emerged, a coalition of worlds that sought strength through unity without falling under the rule of the Federation or the Empire. This coalition would come to be known as the Alliance of Independent Systems. The foundations for the alliance had been laid years earlier through a series of informal agreements between trade networks and security coalitions operating in the frontier. However, the turning point came in early 3230, when representatives from dozens of independent worlds gathered in Alioth, a system that had long resisted superpower control. Over the course of several months, diplomatic negotiations transformed these scattered agreements into a formalized interstellar alliance. By the end of the year, the Alliance of Independent Systems was officially declared, with its first prime minister taking office to oversee its growing membership. Unlike the rigid hierarchical structures of the Federation and the Empire, the alliance was built on the principles of mutual cooperation and self-governance. Each member system retained full control over its own affairs while benefiting from shared defense pacts, trade agreements, and technological exchanges. No single leader or governing body dictated policy. Instead, representatives from each system convened in a rotating council to deliberate on matters of collective interest. The Prime Minister's role was not that of an absolute ruler, but rather a coordinator, an individual tasked with balancing the diverse needs of the alliance while ensuring that its principles of independence and cooperation remained intact. By late 3230, the alliance had already begun establishing its first unified military and trade networks. Joint patrols were deployed to safeguard critical trade routes, and new economic policies facilitated commerce between member worlds. While the Federation and the Empire initially dismissed the alliance as a loose confederation doomed to collapse under its own contradictions, they soon realized that it was something far more resilient. The strength of the alliance lay in its adaptability, its ability to grow and evolve without the bureaucratic stagnation of the Federation or the rigid traditions of the Empire. Despite facing immense challenges in its early years, the Alliance of Independent Systems had succeeded in creating an alternative to the binary power struggle that had long defined human space. It was a fragile experiment, But for those who had spent generations caught between two giants, it represented something far more important: hope. The systems that had joined the alliance were no longer alone, and for the first time in centuries, there was a third path in the galaxy, one that promised to respect the sovereignty of its people while ensuring their protection in an increasingly hostile universe. By 3240, the struggle for resources had become the defining conflict of human space. With expansion accelerating and colonies growing at an unprecedented rate, the demand for raw materials, particularly rare metals, fuel sources, and industrial compounds, had begun to outstrip supply. While the Federation and the Empire had long competed over these assets, the emergence of the Alliance introduced a third major player into the ongoing battle for economic dominance. What had once been a two-sided conflict now became an intricate power struggle, as independent systems aligned with the Alliance sought to carve out their own stake in the galaxy's wealth. Tensions rose sharply in early 3241 when a Federation-backed mining consortium attempted to claim rights to a rich asteroid field in the Lav system, only to be met with resistance from local forces allied with the Alliance. Though open war was avoided, the skirmish led to weeks of diplomatic posturing, with both sides accusing the other of violating interstellar agreements. The Empire, ever opportunistic, used the situation to expand its own resource operations, securing key sites in systems such as Prism and Akinar's outer territories. As disputes over mining rights escalated, small-scale battles between corporate security forces, independent prospectors, and government-aligned military units became a regular occurrence along the frontier. By 3245, the conflicts had spread beyond asteroid belts and planetary mining zones, with each superpower attempting to exert influence over newly discovered resource-rich worlds. In one of the more infamous incidents of the decade, a large-scale engagement erupted over a gas giant in the Beta Hydri system, where Federation and Imperial mining fleets clashed in low orbit after months of territorial disputes. Though both sides downplayed the confrontation as an operational misunderstanding, classified reports suggested that multiple capital-class vessels had been deployed before a ceasefire was brokered. The Alliance, meanwhile, struggled to maintain control over its own assets, as corporate interests within its ranks often pursued deals that conflicted with its founding principles of mutual cooperation. Despite the growing number of skirmishes, neither the Federation, the Empire, nor the Alliance could afford an all-out war. The costs, both economic and military, were too high, and each side understood that prolonged conflict would weaken their hold over the territories they had already secured. Instead, a fragile status quo developed, with power shifting constantly as corporations, mercenary groups, and local governments jockeyed for position in an increasingly unstable economic landscape. By the close of the decade, it had become clear that resource competition would continue to be a driving force in interstellar politics. While full-scale war had been avoided, the foundations of conflict had been firmly laid. As humanity pushed ever further into the void, the question was no longer whether these tensions would escalate, but when. By 3250, the Alliance of Independent Systems had begun to solidify its position as a stabilizing force in the frontier. Unlike the rigid structures of the Federation and the Empire, the Alliance had always relied on negotiation and cooperation rather than direct military enforcement. Recognizing that survival depended on unity, Alliance representatives worked tirelessly to broker trade and non-aggression agreements between member worlds and their neighbors. These diplomatic efforts, while slow and often complex, started to bring a measure of security to regions that had long been plagued by instability. One of the most critical successes came in early 3251, when a series of trade agreements were signed between Alliance-aligned systems and independent colonies in the Old World sector. This move allowed for the free exchange of resources without interference from corporate interests or superpower-backed factions, strengthening economic ties and reinforcing the Alliance's reputation as a trustworthy mediator. By 3253, similar agreements had been reached in sectors such as Listi and Disso, reducing the frequency of territorial disputes that had previously led to violent skirmishes. Despite these diplomatic victories, true peace remained elusive. Pockets of lawlessness still thrived in the unregulated regions between major settlements where pirate groups and mercenary factions operated beyond the reach of any governing body. The Alliance, lacking the vast military infrastructure of the Federation or the disciplined naval forces of the Empire, struggled to respond to these threats with force. Instead, it relied on local security initiatives, often contracting independent pilots and regional defense forces to patrol trade lanes and escort convoys. This decentralized approach was not always effective, but reinforced the Alliance's commitment to self-governance, allowing each system to maintain control over its own affairs while benefiting from the larger network of cooperation. By 3255, the Alliance had proven that its model could work. While it lacked the raw power of its superpower rivals, it had successfully stabilized many previously volatile regions, demonstrating that diplomacy and economic collaboration could be just as effective as military dominance. However, the challenges of governing such a loose coalition remained. Internal disagreements over trade policies, defense strategies, and political representation continued to test the limits of its leadership. Some feared that without a more centralized command structure, the Alliance would struggle to maintain its influence in the long term. Even so, for the countless systems that had spent generations trapped between the ambitions of the Federation and the Empire, the Alliance offered something they had never truly known: a voice in their own future. As trade flourished and mutual defense pacts strengthened, many in the frontier saw the Alliance not just as an alternative, but as the only path forward for those who refused to be ruled by distant powers. Whether it could maintain that vision in the face of growing external pressures, however, remained to be seen. The Alliance's rise underscored humanity's fragmentation into three major superpowers. Each pursued its own vision of prosperity, whether fueled by corporate capitalism, Federation, Imperial tradition, Empire, or collaborative independence, Alliance. Yet none could ignore the persistent chatter of possible alien resurgence, set against the equally pressing needs of frontier expansion. From the mid-3250s onward, a new wave of explorers, entrepreneurs, and opportunists journeyed far beyond the confines of the core systems. They discovered relics of an ancient, extinct alien civilization, later named the Guardians, and encountered more frequent, deliberate thargoid actions, suggesting the insectoid race was reemerging on a large scale. Between 3270 and 3290, the discovery of Guardian ruins reshaped humanity's understanding of its place in the galaxy. Long dismissed as myth or speculation, the existence of an ancient, highly advanced alien civilization was finally confirmed when deep space explorers uncovered remnants of vast structures scattered across multiple planetary surfaces. These ruins, found primarily in regions of space once thought barren, held intricate carvings, unknown alloys, and databanks filled with unreadable information. Initial surveys suggested that the Guardians had flourished millennia ago before vanishing, leaving behind only silent monuments to their lost empire. The first confirmed Guardian ruins were located in 3272, triggering an immediate rush to secure and study the sites. Independent pilots, megacorporations, and research institutions raced against one another to retrieve artifacts, decipher alien scripts, and unlock the secrets of Guardian technology. By 3075, reverse engineering efforts had yielded promising results, with scientists confirming that Guardian relics contained traces of energy signatures far beyond human technological understanding. Some of the most aggressive developments came from private military contractors who sought to integrate Guardian weapon systems into modern human fleets. However, what began as an archaeological effort soon became something far more dangerous. By 3280, reports surfaced of increasing thargoid activity in regions surrounding Guardian ruins. At first, the correlation was dismissed as coincidence. Thargoids had shown little interest in human settlements before, aside from sporadic attacks on isolated convoys and colonies. But as more Guardian technology was extracted and transported across human space, Thargoid incursions grew bolder. In 3283, an entire research convoy was lost near the Sinuif sector, its last transmission capturing a brief, garbled distress call, followed by the eerie silence that had become synonymous with Thargoid encounters. By 3285, it became clear that humanity's growing interference with Guardian relics had triggered an unwanted response. Some researchers speculated that the Thargoids and the Guardians had once been rivals, perhaps even enemies in an ancient war long forgotten. If true, humanity's reckless harvesting of Guardian technology may have been seen as a provocation, a sign that their old enemies' weapons were once again active. Despite these warnings, efforts to extract and weaponize Guardian artifacts continued. In 32 and 88, classified reports indicated that experimental Guardian human hybrid weapons had been tested in secret with mixed success. While the technology showed promise, there was growing fear that each new breakthrough only invited greater retaliation. By the end of 3290, the situation had escalated to a dangerous new phase. Thargoid attacks had become more coordinated, more targeted. No longer were they just harassing explorers or isolated convoys. They were striking research sites, weapons facilities, and high-value trade routes. The frontier, once a realm of discovery and opportunity, was now a battleground between human ambition and an alien force that seemed determined to drive humanity away from its ancient past. Whether the Thargoids sought to reclaim Guardian space, prevent humanity from unlocking forbidden knowledge, or something else entirely remained unknown. But one truth had become inescapable. The deeper humanity dug into the secrets of the Guardians, the more certain it became that war was coming. By 3300, the fragile illusion that humanity could avoid direct conflict with the Thargoids had begun to unravel. While isolated encounters had been documented for centuries, something had changed. The incursions were no longer limited to unexplored regions or deep space expeditions. Thargoid vessels had begun appearing in human-controlled systems with alarming frequency. At first, these sightings were dismissed as anomalies, but as reports accumulated, it became clear that the Thargoids were moving with purpose. Their presence was no longer passive. They were testing defenses, disrupting trade routes, and, in some cases, striking directly at humanity's infrastructure. In 3301, the first confirmed station attack occurred. Civitas Outpost, a mid-sized orbital installation near the Pleiades sector, was found completely disabled, its inhabitants missing or dead. The hull bore deep, biomechanical scars consistent with Thargoid weaponry. The event sent shockwaves through the superpowers, forcing the Federation and the Empire to acknowledge what independent pilots had already suspected: human space was under siege. The following years saw a steady increase in these incursions. Stations went dark without warning, entire convoys disappeared, and in 3303, Aegis, a joint task force between the superpowers, was formed to coordinate a response. It was a rare moment of cooperation between the Federation and the Empire, driven not by politics but by survival. Despite the deployment of Aegis, the attacks intensified. In 33304, the first confirmed planetary bombardments were reported. Settlements on distant worlds were found abandoned, their structures melted and twisted beyond recognition. Analysts struggled to determine the Thargoids' intentions. Were they reclaiming old territory, responding to humanity's exploitation of Guardian technology, or waging a war of extermination? As researchers sought answers, the Pilots Federation mobilized its most experienced members to act where bureaucracies failed. Elite pilots took on the most dangerous assignments: gathering intelligence, salvaging wreckage from destroyed stations, and testing experimental weapons based on Guardian technology. These operations, though unofficial, became the front line of defense as human fleets struggled to adapt to the Thargoids' superior maneuverability and bio-organic weaponry. By 3306, breakthroughs in hybrid Guardian human technology provided humanity's first real means of fighting back. New weapon platforms and defensive measures were deployed, though their effectiveness remained inconsistent against the unpredictable alien threat. In 33307, entire systems in the Pleiades and Witchhead Nebula fell silent as Thargoid forces overwhelmed human defenses. Civilian evacuations became routine, with pilots running rescue operations to save thousands from doomed stations. Despite coordinated military efforts, humanity remained on the back foot. Every victory felt temporary. Every successful defense brought only a brief reprieve. By 3308, it was clear that the war had fully arrived. The question was no longer whether the Thargoids were here to stay, but whether humanity could withstand the storm that was coming. As the superpowers scrambled to reinforce their borders and the Pilots' Federation continued its desperate fight on the front lines, one undeniable truth loomed over every system. Humanity had never faced a threat like this before, and survival was far from guaranteed. By 3309, the galaxy had changed. The Thargoid War was no longer a distant conflict fought in the shadows of uncharted space. It was everywhere. From the Pleiades to the core systems, no faction, corporation, or independent colony could claim to be untouched. Humanity now faced the reality of a war with an enemy that did not negotiate, did not seek diplomacy, and did not falter. Every major power scrambled to adapt, but their responses were as fragmented as ever, each shaped by their own ambitions, fears, and limitations. The Federation, ever pragmatic, doubled down on corporate partnerships to fuel its military machine. Massive defense contracts were awarded to Core Dynamics, Lacan, and other weapons manufacturers, accelerating the production of experimental anti-xeno weaponry. Research stations, hidden deep in the black, worked around the clock to develop new ways to fight the Thargoids, but their methods remained classified, even to high-ranking officials. Some whispered that entire fleets had been outfitted with technologies bordering on the dangerous or even unethical. Hybrid systems designed not just to destroy the Thargoids, but to manipulate or control them. For the Federation's leadership, survival meant superiority, and they were willing to pay any price to achieve it. The Empire, meanwhile, took a different approach. Recognizing that human-controlled space was shrinking with each Thargoid advance, Imperial High Command fortified its holdings, withdrawing from vulnerable sectors to secure its core territories. A new defensive doctrine took shape, one that prioritized controlled retreats and counteroffensives rather than reckless engagements. Senators debated policy in Achenaar's grand halls, while Imperial intelligence quietly ensured that internal dissent remained suppressed. Rumors circulated that high-ranking nobles had secured safe passage to hidden systems, preparing for the worst should the war turn against them. Yet, even as its leadership plotted its next moves, the Empire's citizens prepared for war, training its next generation of pilots and soldiers to defend Imperial space at all costs. The Alliance, true to its nature, sought alternative paths. Lacking the centralized military strength of its rivals, it leaned heavily on Guardian technology, integrating what little it could salvage into its defensive infrastructure. By 3310, Alliance forces had begun fielding hybrid weapons at an unprecedented scale, with mixed success. At the same time, the Alliance remained the most active in organizing civilian evacuations, turning its network of independent pilots into a lifeline for those fleeing from doomed systems. While it lacked the sheer firepower of the Federation or the strategic discipline of the Empire, the Alliance's adaptability and growing reliance on cutting-edge alien technology made it unpredictable. Whether that would be enough to survive the coming storm remained uncertain. Beyond the superpowers, smaller factions and independent pilots continued to carve out their own fates. Some became heroes, leading desperate rescue operations and fighting Thargoid incursions where the major powers refused to intervene. Others turned to the black market, smuggling rare alien materials or scavenging abandoned settlements for anything of value. A growing number of mercenary groups and rogue scientists sought to profit from the chaos, selling weapons, information, or even experimental Thargoid hybrid technology to the highest bidder. For many, the line between survival and exploitation blurred, and morality became an afterthought. As 3309 gave way to the years beyond, one truth became clear. Humanity stood at a crossroads. Every faction, every pilot, every system faced a choice: fight, flee, or adapt. The war against the Thargoids was far from over, and in the vast, cold emptiness of space, there were no guarantees. Some still clung to the belief that humanity could push back, that technology, strategy, and sheer resilience could turn the tide. Others believed that survival was a matter of compromise, that perhaps the war could be ended by understanding the enemy rather than destroying it. And in the darkest corners of the galaxy, there were those who saw opportunity in the chaos, waiting for the moment when the old powers would fall and something new could rise from the ruins. The galaxy had been at war before. Empires had risen and fallen, alliances had been forged and broken, and countless lives had been lost in the name of power and progress. But never before had humanity faced a threat like this. The question was no longer whether they could win, but whether they could endure.